Hey guys, this is your high fist, the cipher of Malastu, the chancellor of Ruthenbad University, here after one of my typically long breaks to bring you yet another juicy topic. As always, thank you to Steven Erikson for sharing and almost commenting on my last video. So, guys, what we have today is a topic that we have touched on in different forms in many videos, but I haven't really crystallized my thoughts in a specific discussion. So, here it is. Let me just pull up my notes. I have an actual presentation for this one. We will be exploring Steven Erikson's handling of the noble savage stereotype with the Barghast as a case study. So let's quickly run through what the noble savage is and what Erikson is doing here. So the noble savage is a trope, a mindset almost, which is the opposite of the primitive savage mindset. So just as how many see these pre-industrial, usually non-Western indigenous cultures as dumb savages who essentially need to be civilized like animals, just as how there's a group that believes that. There's an other group which sees these societies in a really romanticized way, where the savages live as one with nature. They don't really fight wars like evil modern industrial societies do. They live in harmony with each other, supposedly. They're all noble and honorable. They are uncorrupted by the evils of civilization, blah, blah, blah. The trope is often attributed to Jean Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, although there's a much longer history than that, and he himself had very little to do with that trope. In fact, it could be argued that the Germania, which was written by, I believe his name was Cornelius Tacitus in the first century AD, it was an ethnographic study of Germanic tribes outside the Roman Empire. You could argue that that is the first known work in the Western tradition which pushes the idea of a noble savage, because Cornelius Tacitus inserts a lot of these romanticized tropes in there about how these harmonious Germans are so content to be one with nature in contrast to the selfish and calculated and civilized Roman. And of course, I do need to interject here with my usual non-Western shtick, predictably, by stating that this trope is present in the East as well, including in Chinese, Indian, and Arab traditions. In Hindu mythology, for example, there's the story of Kannapar, who's a tribal whose purity and innocence makes him one of Lord Shiva's esteemed followers, known as the Nayanars. The Arab polymath Ibn Tufail wrote the famous novel Living Son of the Vigilant in 1160, which is all about this wild man whose purity and harmony with nature once again brings him closer to Allah. So it's an international trope and a universal tendency, is my point. But it was really in the age of exploration, in the age of conquest, I guess you could call it, that the trope started becoming really geopolitically significant, since it started shaping how certain parts of the world saw other parts of the world. In the 1580 essay of Cannibals, the French Renaissance philosopher Michel de Montaigne, he introduced this concept of nature's gentleman, where he argued that cannibalistic tribal practices in Brazil were just as moral in their own way as Western moral values. This is one of the earliest examples of not just the noble savage trope, but moral relativism in general. And you can see how this stereotype would go on to impact people further down the line. There's the famous novel Uronoko, for example, which is, I think it's the first interracial romance novel between an African guy and a European woman. It was such a hit even way back in 1688 that it had to be adapted into a successful play later on and all that. And all this culminates a generation later with the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's still credited for creating the term noble savage, even though many modern scholars have pointed out that he had nothing at all to do with the creation of that trope. But Rousseau's basic point that man was innately good and that it was external factors which made humanity do bad things. That is the underlying ethos of the noble savage stereotype. It's his moral philosophy that humans are innately good, which serves as the fuel for most modern day noble savage myths and approaches. It's his moral philosophy, for example, that's often seen as the counterpoint to Thomas Hobbes's theory on human nature, both of which Steven Erikson opposes, by the way. And that is why, even though people like Ellingson have shown that Rousseau has nothing to do with the creation of the trope, he is still associated with this label. There are many modern anthropologists and philosophers who still have this view, by the way. So, not only is this widespread in all kinds of casual discourse, there's a lot of scholarly work being done with people insisting on this notion that tribal life was somehow less violent than civilized life. We call this primitivism in the field. So, you have Brian Ferguson, who's a very serious and credible scholar who holds this view, Jonathan Haas, John Zerzan. There are lots of well known scholars, philosophers who are supportive of the general idea that tribal societies are more peaceful than quote unquote civilized ones. On the other hand, there are anthropologists like Roger Sandel and David Graeber, particularly, who are opposed to any kind of robotic and unrealistic dichotomy that's being shown in these societies, and they argue that both extremes are wrong. And there's, of course, a vast amount of military history that shows us just how brutal tribal societies were and just how devastating tribal wars were. I've often quoted Max Bootz's An Epic History of Guerrilla Warfare on this channel. That's a great book for this topic. There's, of course, the famous War Before Civilization by the archaeologist Lawrence Healy, which documents a lot of the most gruesome aspects of nomadic and tribal warfare. We can look at the recent scholarship that talks about Native American tribes, for example, like Sam Gwynn's Empire of the Summer Moon. We can look at novels like Joseph Boyden's The Orenda, and you'll see that there's plenty of evidence for how brutal many of these societies are. Even Charles Dickens famously denounced the noble savage trope back in his day because he thought it was crazy. So, why is this portrayal bad? And why is Erikson against this kind of thing? It's bad because, number one, it's dehumanizing and factually false. It's a way in which the inherently multifaceted personality of any human being, of any culture, is condensed into one political narrative. And that person's identity is being reduced to this powerless, innocent, cartoonishly noble creature. It's a way in which the real identities and values of a community are sterilized. And there's a great loss of dignity in that. I mean, it's one thing for racists to say things which dehumanize you, at least that's what they intend. But it's a whole other issue when the anti racists stereotype you in a way that strips away your humanity on the same level, but is just done under a more protective and humane context. It could even be argued that this kind of benevolence, like the noble savage, which insists on caricaturing you for its benevolence, one could argue that this is far more humiliating than being the butt of direct racism, because you're being robbed even of the right to victimhood when the anti racists are the ones stereotyping you. At least with the racists, there's a narrative of victimhood you can lean on for support, right? Here, there's nothing. So that's why it's wrong on a general level. But why does something like this bother Steven Erikson so much? Why is this philosophy inherently incompatible with tropes like the noble savage or the primitive savage, for that matter, or moral relativism? These are all incompatible with Erikson's philosophy. Why? It's because of what I keep discussing in many of these videos, the theme of Eriksonian humanism. So, Erikson's writing, and I've really thought about this, Erikson's writing has one singular objective, in my opinion, and that is to unify readers across the world into seeing the commonality of human beings. That, I would argue, is a singular objective as a writer, and the singular theme of the 10 big books. I mean, think of what the 10 big books are, right? Let's just pause and break this down for a second. Let's think of what the 10 big books are. They are essentially stories which showcase a huge array of societies, all of which exist in different topographies, climates, religious beliefs, political systems, folklore, culture, blah, blah. All of that is different. And yet, ultimately, what we see as the readers is that they're all the same. They're all prone to the same sins and the same virtues in their own way. The theme of the 10 big books isn't really compassion and empathy. I'm sorry. The actual theme of the 10 big books is that there is a commonality to the human condition. That is why world building is so important to this series, right? It's not just that we are getting this incredibly diverse world which feels like it's breathing and organic. It's not just that there are hundreds of cultures and dozens of races with unique histories. It's that Erikson manages to create a world with all of that, which I just mentioned, and still, at the same time, manages to get across the fact that we are all the same, that there's a universality to the human condition which will always exist regardless of how diverse people are culturally or racially or economically. This is why the anthropological richness of the 10 big books goes hand in hand with the moral philosophy of it, because the diversity itself is used to emphasize the commonality rather than used to take away from it. The more cultures we encounter in the series, the more we realize how alike they all are. He makes us see the similarities by showing us the differences. That is Erikson in a nutshell. And that's why he is against so many of these tropes, even though they might not outwardly look as harmful as other tropes. Why the Barghast for this discussion? I've already done a video on Hetan and the Hobbling, so you guys can click on that if you wanted info on that topic. So what's the point? What's there beyond that? The more I thought about this question, the more I realized that the Malasan discourse around the Barghast is so dominated by the hobbling that we forget all the other dimensions of the Barghast story. And that's a shame, if you ask me, because there's actually a great tale there about the self destructive savagery of the Barghast that's still relevant even today. Another reason I picked them for this analysis is because Erikson himself has said once that he wasn't really trying to deconstruct the noble savage theme when he wrote about the Barghast, since he had already done that with Casa. So it's also a great example of how the general theme of Eriksonian humanism deconstructs the noble savage trope, rather than Erikson the craftsman, Erikson the writer, consciously trying to shape something. And I hope to demonstrate through this that the Barghast deserve a lot more space and discussion in the Malazan discourse beyond Hetan's individual storyline, even though that is one of the foundations as well. So let's look at some of the ways in which Erikson fights both stereotypes in his portrayal of the Barghast, both the primitive savage trope and the noble savage trope, because that's his objective here. He's not subverting the noble savage cliche by simply turning them all into stereotypical primitive savages. He's ensuring that his portrayal of the Barghast refutes both extremes. So the first little tidbit we get is in book one, Gardens of the Moon, which is not really a tidbit, but it's interesting nonetheless, and I wanted it included here. There are lots of races mentioned in book one: humans, Tistandi, Jagut, Tilanaimas, Folkrolosane, Kachen Chamal, demons, Tis Leosin. And yet, do you know the only race for whom the word savage is used in book one? The Barghast. And not just once either. Kaladin Brood is called a Barghast, is called a savage in his storyline, and he's a Barghast. Trots is called a savage in his storyline, and he's a Barghast. And the people who ambush Lorne they are called savages, and they are Barghasts. The word savage is, of course, used in other contexts like savage swings of the sword and his hand yanked savagely on it, or his face twisted into a savage grin and stuff like that. But nobody is actually called a savage in Gardens of the Moon other than three specific sort of entities, and that's Kaladin Brood, Trots, and the people who ambush Lorne. Other than these guys, no one else does, and they all come from different storylines, right? It's not like they're all in one scene or one storyline and they're collectively called savages in a scene. No, they all appear in vastly different parts of the novel. So that's a great piece of foreshadowing there, where Erikson is already setting up how the Barghast story is being retold through the crippled gods narration, because as I said, almost every race in the series is mentioned somewhere in book one, and yet it's only people who happen to be Barghast who get referred to as savages. So it's clear that right from the very beginning, there is an intention here to use the Barghast to explore what a savage is. Another interesting aspect of this is how Erikson flips the script, so to speak, in the series by using both tropes to subvert them. So the Barghast obviously have a significant role as a race in two books, right? Memories of Ice and Dust of Dreams. And you can clearly see the tonal difference in their portrayal when we look at both books. In Memories of Ice, Erikson intentionally pushes them in the noble savage spectrum to bait us into a false sense of security. We're all like, oh, haha, there go the Barghast. They're crazy and savage, but they sure know how to have a good time. Oh, haha, look at Trots, that good old savage. Oh, haha, look at Haton and how she wants to get laid. Oh, Talamandus, the talking stick figure thingy. Haha. And then Dust of Dreams hits us, and we go from seeing them from like noble savages to hardcore balls deep primitive savage mode. And Erikson makes us see the hypocrisy of our own worldview in book three, where we perceive them as these goofy savages, which is what they were in Memories of Ice. And he shows us just how devastatingly savage that kind of culture would actually be when it exists. Because in Memories of Ice, we enjoy their shenanigans. We don't really dwell on the savagery that makes such a culture possible. And in Dust of Dreams, we get that in full force. And all that gruesome stuff happens to the very people whom we laughed along with in Memories of Ice. A lot of readers say Dust of Dreams ruined Memories of Ice for them. I've heard a lot of people say that the Barghast storyline retroactively took away from their enjoyment of book three when they think back. Now, I realize that they mean it as a criticism, but in a way, it's also a great compliment to how authentic Erikson's writing is, because that's precisely what he was going for. His objective, I would argue, was to make you relook your own perception of the Barghast in book three. If your complaint is that you saw them as these jolly barbarians who like to kill and fuck and all that, and this illusion was shattered in book three, which is what I hear a lot of people say as a negative comment, I would suggest that Erikson has succeeded rather than failed in what he was attempting to do, because it means that you now look at the Barghast with a far broader perspective. And it means that you realize how wrong you were to caricature them as noble savages. In some ways, it reminds me of what Alan Moore did with superheroes in Watchmen, because it seemed like Alan Moore was saying, oh, you guys like superheroes, do you? You guys think it's fun and jolly to have people dress up in weird costumes and fight crime, do you? Well, let me show you the type of society which would actually facilitate this. Let me show you just how fucked up a person would have to be to put on a mask and go kill bad people. He was taking the romanticization of the superhero concept and showing us the darker side of what it would actually be like. And that's what Erikson does with the Barghast in Dust of Dreams. Let's look at some of the quotes in the series now about the Barghast, which I think are interesting. There's a quote that Setok has in Dust of Dreams, and even though she's not Barghast, she's living with them and been raised by them, so why not use her quote? So she says, God, my children, does not await us in the wilderness. God, my children, is the wilderness. Witness its laws and be humbled. In humility, find peace. But know this, peace is not always life. Sometimes peace is death. In the face of this, how can one not be humble? The wild laws are the only laws. End quote. Basically, what she says is, look, just because some people are one with nature, that doesn't make them delicate or non-violent, because sometimes peace is death. I like this quote because it really captures that kind of animist, one with nature type vibe that tribals have, but without taking the edge away from it either. Because Sitok is like, look, God isn't some entity living in the forest. It's the forest itself that's God. It's nature itself that's God. But she also says, look, but the peace that this God brings is not just life, it can also be death. And it's a subtle warning from Sitok herself, who is raised by wolves, and her warning is not to romanticize being one with nature. She says, look at the quote again, know this, peace is not always life, peace is also death. And she says, look, there are no laws of nature that will save you. The wild laws are the only laws. Kafal and Sitok have a few interesting conversations in this vein where they unpack many of these kind of uh, tropes. There's one scene where Kafal really displays a lot of wisdom. He looks at the stars and he says, the firmament is speckled with countless worlds no different from ours. To the stars and to the great burning wagons, we are as motes of dust. So he displays a Carl Sagan type of cosmic wisdom and awareness here, where he realizes that the planet he lives on is just a mote of dust. But when he says that, Sitok immediately asks, oh, is that what the Barghast believe? And Kafal just changes the topic immediately because that's obviously not what the Barghast believe. The Barghast gods are not that wise. The Barghast are driving themselves to extinction because of their own savage need for war. As Hetan tells Tool in the very first Barghast scene in Book 9, we are white-faced Barghast. Find us an enemy. And this simple line encapsulates the tragedy of the Barghast. They are all looking for a fight that will lead them to historical glory, and they have no idea that it's about to push them into complete annihilation. It's the same thing we see with the Tebla, the Owl, with so many of these savage societies who are driving themselves to extinction because of their own stupidity and violence. And this is even stated in a great line where Iruklas, who belongs to one of these dying tribal races itself, he says, the real war is against stupidity. How could I have not understood that? How could I not have understood that? I fucked up the line anyway. And this is the tragedy of these savages in the 10 big books. On one side, you have empires like the Malazans and the Letheri committing genocide for real. And on the other, you have many of these races just driving themselves to extinction because of their own short sightedness. And it's amazing how Erikson manages to strike just the right balance between the two. And finally, I'd like to touch on Kaladin Brood in this discussion because he adds a whole new dimension to the savage trope in general. Obviously, Brood is Barghast only in the sense that Ola Rethel is an Aimas, but he's pretty much Barghast as far as the 10 big books are concerned. I've always found it interesting that for all their savagery, who is the person entrusted with that one weapon which can destroy the world? It's Kaladin Brood, a Barghast. Think of what a huge statement that is subtextually from Erikson. Barghast's hammer, Brood's hammer, is the equivalent of what in our world would be the red button, the ability to initiate a nuclear war, to end the world as we know it, essentially. In our world, we consider this the ultimate moral responsibility. There is no responsibility with a higher stake than that, the power to destroy the world. And in the Malazan world, the one entrusted with that responsibility is a Barghast. And he lives up to that trust. That's the great thing about him. He defies the saying that power corrupts. He has the ultimate power in the world, but he also has the wisdom to not unleash it or be corrupted by it, unless he meets Krupp, of course. In which case, Brood reverts to a savage, but who can blame him, right? I guess that's another example of where the primitive savage and the noble savage tropes are played around with. Kaladin Brood is this noble savage who cares about the world and is this great level-headed military leader and all that. And all it takes is Krupp's babble for this gentleman warrior to reveal his true colors as a primitive savage and take out that hammer to wreck shit. So that interplay is always present, and it makes the treatment here so flavorful. So those are my basic points, guys. I'm obviously leaving a lot out here. There's the great duel between Trots and the Barghast chief's son in Memories of Ice, where Trots fights like a Malazan soldier and his opponent fights in the Barghast way, so he doesn't really know how to counter Trots. The subtext in that scene is amazing, with how the ways of war are contrasted by shrinking the battlefield down to the smallest possible unit of two people in a duel. And it also then becomes a microcosm for the reason tribal societies ultimately perished under the hands of more disciplined armies. So that's one. There's the story of Sikara the Vile, who's probably one of Erikson's most unlikable and weirdly intelligent characters and deserves a video entirely about her. The way she uses basic psychological tricks to amass power in this monstrous culture is just remarkable. And of course, I'm leaving out a lot of the Barghast political stuff about one faction wanting to go to war and one faction with Tool and Kafal not wanting to go to war. So there's a lot of stuff I'm leaving out, but as the title suggests, this was simply meant to be an introduction. I just wanted to register the fact, as I have before, that the Malazan series is not just postmodern and that it does take up strong moral positions on certain issues, and the twin rejection of both the primitive savage and the noble savage is an example of one of those positions. It's not something like using Casa to subvert Robert T. Howard's Conan. It's not even something like Coltrane, for example, who is another, by the way, example of a really complex deconstruction of the noble savage trope. Erikson's stance on these things is quite clear when you read these books. And once again, it's all because of that fundamental motive behind his writing, which is to write stories which highlight the universality of humanity. So that's it from my end, guys. I hope you found this interesting. I hope some of this stuff makes you revisit these books and get extra enjoyment when you do it. This is your High Fist. Take care, and I'll see you soon.